Hi, everybody. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep, see, great.
All right, cool. Okay, so Stellar has become a common way for us to expand the functionality of a number of pieces of our system inside of Metron. So I thought it was reasonable to go through a little tutorial about how to add your own Stellar function. So this would be, so the one we're going to pick is really simple, but it's an existing gap. So right now we have no way to do like a string substring function, right? So in order to do that, I've moved over here into Metron Common. You know, where the location of your function, the implementation of your function really is going to depend on the nature of the function. So for us, we have a group of other string functions inside of this class called string functions, like regex matching, to lower, to upper. I'm just going to add it here. So, but before I start, I created a test to kind of describe the interface. So hopefully, so we're going to have a function called substring, and it's going to function just like the Java strings substring. So you give it the initial index and the final index, and it's going to give you the substring. So if I'm calling substring on foo bar with 0.3, I expect to return foo. Also, the end should be optional. So Stellar functions have a variable number of arguments. So if I don't specify an end, it should be assumed, just like in the Java substring function, that it's the end of the string. Okay? So we test the happy path, we test some bad path, and in general, we get an implementation. But in order for this to work, so we're going to run it, and we should see errors. So we're going to red-green debug. We're going to red-green implement. So you'll notice a lag here initially. It's going through the class path and assembling all of the different functions. And the way it figures out the function, so you'll notice it failed, which is what we expect, because it's unable to resolve a function named substring, because we haven't implemented it yet. Okay, so let's implement it. So the way that we implement a function is we have a couple of different aspects. We're going to call our class substring. And we're going to implement Stellar function, which is an interface. I'm going to implement these methods. There's three methods. There's apply, initialize, and isInitialized. Apply actually does the hard work of your function. Initialize is a one-time call. It's called exactly once when the function initializes, and it's given a context. This context object is how you pass in information from outside of the Stellar ecosystem into Stellar. So things like Zookeeper configs and stuff like that, like the Zookeeper client, for instance. For us, we have no need for that. And also it is initialized to determine if the function is initialized properly. All right? So we're going to return true there because there's no initialization required. And we're going to get to the hard work of implementing this. But before we get started, in order to register a Stellar function, our class is providing a Stellar function. There's a custom annotation here. And in the annotation, we have 4 different fields that we have to provide, or that we should provide. Most of them are defaulted, but you probably want to specify almost everything except the namespace. For us, we're gonna keep it in the default namespace, but we want to call our function substring. And it's going to have certain parameters, which is a list of parameters. Whoops. Our first parameter is the string. The string to be substringed, let's call it. The second parameter is the beginning index. And the final parameter is the optional ending index. Our function has to return something. It returns a substring. Obviously, I wouldn't be as lax in my documentation if it were a real function. Maybe I would. You see my code. All right, so let's get to the hard work here. So it passes in a list of objects and a context, but we don't really care so much about the context. We're just going to pass the arguments in. So we're going to need the string here. We'll initialize it. Begin and an end. So let's stage it. If args.size is greater than or equal to 1, then we have a string there. But it's an object. So we'll look at the object. If the string object is null, then we can't do anything. So we're just going to return null back. We want to be as liberal as possible, or we want to handle as many errors as we possibly can in these functions. So if it's null, or if it's not a string, then we want to return null. Otherwise, I can cast it. Okay. For the purposes of this, we're not going to try to coerce, non-string types into strings. We'll be very, very explicit. So that takes care of string. If we have a second argument, then it's going to be begin. Okay, so for begin, let's be a little bit more liberal. It should be an integer. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to use a helper function here inside of Metron that uses Apache beans to convert from a variety of types. So we're going to try to coerce this into an integer. So that means if it's a double, it'll get cast to an integer. If it's the string 1, you'll get converted into the integer 1. So we're going to be very liberal in how we handle this. Okay. We'll do a similar thing for end. Okay. So now we've gotten all of our arguments staged. And we know that string is not null. Or if string is null, then we return null already. So however, if begin is null, then we just want to return the string back. Okay. So if end is not null, then we want to return the substring of the begin and the end. Otherwise, just the begin. And we don't need to return null there because we've handled all the cases. So let's go over to our test and see how we did. So with live coding, it's always concerning that we did something wrong. So we're going to run this through. It's initializing and finding the functions. Hopefully it finds our substring. And we have a good run. That's great. But I don't consider it done until I play with it a little bit inside of the REPL. Oops. So in order to run the REPL, since it's inside of common, I'm going over here to common. I'm building the package. I'm skipping all the tests. And I'm gonna call the stellar shell, which is the REPL. So it's gonna build common without the tests, which should take no time at all, or hopefully no time at all, very limited amount of time. And then it's gonna execute the REPL, and it's gonna start it up right here so I can play with it. Maybe I overstayed no time at all. There we go. Okay, so it started the REPL. We're going to wait for the functions to load, and they have. We didn't have very many functions to load. So let's try some substrings out. So I'm going to hit tab, and it's going to autocomplete to substring. So now my function is available inside of Stellar, which means it can be available inside of the field transformations, inside of the Stellar enrichments, as well as inside of the Stellar based threat triage. Let's just make sure it works. And it does. Returns foo, just as I hoped. Let's make sure some of the stranger cases work. If nothing, it should return foo bar, and it does. So with that, I'm going to stop and ask if anyone has any questions. Happy to take them.
Do you have any general rules of thumb of what kind of thought process someone might go through in choosing to implement their own external to the project versus contribute back into Metron proper?
Yeah, sure. So if it's a general purpose tool, certainly consider contributing it back. Going forward, we're probably going to split Stellar into its own project, not part of Metron Common. In fact, we will be doing that. It shouldn't be too hard, but it's going to be its own thing. So if it's a general purpose thing like substring, it makes sense to put it back in. If it's something more specific, like there's a number of models of service based Stellar functions. Those shouldn't necessarily be part of Metron platform, but maybe should be part of Metron Analytics. Or if it's your own thing, it should be part of your own project. So as we get better and more mature in how we sideload jars, it should be, the idea is to be able to drop your own jar on the class path and to have your functions picked up just like you do here, without having to be part of Metron itself. Does that make sense? That's a good question. Any other questions?
It does. Mm-hmm.
It's a quiet group. Okay, with that, I'm going to pass it back to James.
All right, thanks for that, Casey. So I think the next on the menu would be the profiler. Nick, you want to do that?
Hey guys, yeah, sure. Happy Friday, everyone. Okay, so what am I going through? We've talked about the profiler before. We have a kind of server-side topology, right, that generates the profile data, dumps it into HBase. We've also created a client-side API so that when you're doing actual, using the data from the profiler for models, doing like model scoring, you would use this API to extract the data and feed it into your model. So it's something that pairs quite well with the MAS functions that Casey mentioned, like the MAS model apply and that fun stuff. So really the hurdle that I jumped through in getting the client API functions to work with enrichment and parsing was really just an issue with library dependencies. And, you know, it's something that we faced a lot, I think. I think it mainly originates from different versions of transient libraries that Storm and HBase are using. But so when I first started this, we had lots of exclusions, you know, excluding this library, excluding that library. It was getting quite messy, and it was spreading to other projects outside of the profiler projects here. So I had the idea to actually just split it out. So we have a Metron profiler common that has the common code that would be used by both the server side and the client side. So we're talking things like the row builder and column builder. These are things that define how data gets laid down into your data store, like HBase. Some of the stellar hooks, and some of the general kind of data object POJO type stuff. That is all in Profiler Common. Now doing that let me split out the client side and the profiler side so that now we don't have this profiler that is a topology that gets deployed acting as a transient dependency. Now the profiler that gets deployed is kind of a leaf project that no one else depends on. In doing that, I was able to remove, I think, all of those annoying exclusions to get this working. So it might be something that we want to look at for the other projects that we have, because it really made it a lot cleaner. And I was really surprised because it was just kind of magical on how it fixed the issues that I was running into. So now to show actually the effect of all that is what I have is I have Snort running. It's my only sensor running on single node vagrant. We have the PCAP replay running, spitting that canned PCAP data into a virtual NIC. And then we have Snort running, picking up that PCAP data, producing Snort alerts, and the Snort alert that I have defined is just what we have with the default deployment, where it sets up kind of a test alert that says every time I see a packet, throw out a Snort alert. So we're parsing that data, and you can see in Storm, all I have running is my Snort parser topology. And the transformation that I'm going to use, I'm going to say, okay, use Stellar to do transformation for me. I'm going to output profile 1, so a new variable called profile 1, and it's going to look like this. So I just call profile get, which is that client API method. I want this particular profile, and I want to use the IP source address that's coming in the message to do the search for the data that I need. And I want to go over the past 2 days. As we can see here, so this is my HBase table that's storing that profiler data. So as of right now, we've got no profiler data. We have data hitting the Snort topic. And now what I'm going to do is read from the enrichments topic. And you can see I have highlighting in yellow the profile. This is the actual field from here that I'm adding to the message. And you can see it's coming back with nothing, basically, right? So we're running that query and it's not hitting on anything, any profile data. So now what I'm going to do is run this profile writer. This is some code that's out there just to help with unit testing. And I just rigged it up to write a certain IP address that I know shows up in that canned PCAP file. I'm going to go ahead and run this. So now I'm loading a bunch of data. Instead of waiting for the profiler to generate a bunch of data over time, I'm just going to load it all up right away. What I should see is, yeah, there we go. So now I've got some generation or some profile data. And actually, we can already see it hit. So we see certain cases here where I didn't load the data for this particular IP source address, so we still see the empty data. But here we see where it actually hit on some profile data. So this was the profile that I had written. So it's literally a value every 15 minutes over the past 2 days. And that's why we see this big long string here. So I think that's kind of the, that's a good view of how to use that API. It might be a good discussion point for the boards in terms of, how do we get this, or here I should say the boards are on this call in terms of how do we get this kind of timestamp data to a model using the model apply. And maybe Casey can chime in or anybody that knows the MAS functions. But right now it kind of just takes those arguments and adds it as request parameters, which I'm not sure how well that would scale for sending in a bunch of time series data. So it may be something to think about. We may have some enhancements on the model apply to be able to use it efficiently with this, or maybe someone has a good idea of the way to do that. And with that, I'll kind of open it up. Any thoughts, ideas, guys?
So you probably wouldn't be passing the whole time series along, or you might not be. You might be passing this a statistical summary along. That's one point, right? We have the stats functions available as part of Stellar, right?
I think the idea, right, is you want, if you're building a model, so you're saying you would not want to ever put in a big time series like this.
You might, in which case that's fine, but you also, I mean, I would imagine you probably want to just pass in things like statistical summaries. That's why we allow the ability to do the statistical summaries, right?
Right, but then if we pass in the time series, how do we do that with mass model apply?
So you would pass in so you're calling out to the profiler, you're calling out to HBase as part of a Stellar call. You're getting back to time series. You should be able to manipulate those time series with the stats functions, right? Add them all into the stats function, retrieve back a
Oh yeah, I get that use case. I'm saying, so if we agreed, right, that there is a scenario where you would want to actually send in a time series, maybe not of this many values, maybe more, maybe less, but we have got one scenario of the stat summaries. I totally get that. You do a summary, you pass it in, it would pass in as a request parameter. But if I do want to send in a time series, I would think we'd want to post it and maybe formatted JSON or something. And I'm not sure if that's something we can do with the apply as it is or not.
Well, it's just calling in a RESTful interface, right? So however you can pass parameters to REST.
I guess I just see in the function now that it does actually like request. I thought it was doing request parameters versus doing like a post and adding the data to a body, the body of the post.
Request parameters. That could be refactored. That shouldn't be too big of an issue. But when we're pulling back the profile, it looks like we're getting a time series. When we construct the profile on the other end, we have the inits, we have the one that's called each time tick, and then we have the what we're storing in HBase. Is that this looks like a series of numbers, but those could be it could be a series of objects too, correct? It's not restricted to numbers.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, all right. I just want to point that out.
So I mean, in that case, you would have even more kind of massaging, I think, that you would need to do in the model apply or prior to handing that off to the model apply to say, how do I serialize these objects in a fashion that I can then transmit over the wire to my model to do something with.
It all depends on how you want to aggregate that, right? We provided one way with the statistical functions. If you need another way, you'll have to provide another, like a slice and dice type of thing. However you want to transform that data.
All right, guys, any more questions on this? All right, good deal, Nick. Outside of this, there were a couple of minor bug fixes, probably not worth going over in this demo, unless I'll open it up, to the grander community. Does anybody have any bug fixes that they wanted to demo this meeting? All right, so let's move this along. And the last item for the meeting that I wanted to address was the comments from our Apache build. So we do have a valid release that came out yesterday. And so we received 3 +1s, but 2 of the +1s had some conditions applied to it, primarily due to licensing, or how the license files are staged, and versions of various jars. So we're going to be probably fixing that next week and then follow up with the next release with these items fixed. Other than that, I don't have anything else on the agenda. I'll open it up to the floor. Does anybody have any questions or comments, or we're going to call the meeting? Going once, going twice. All right, guys. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you here in 2 weeks.